Mr. Abheek Singhi leads the Boston Consulting Group's consumer and retail practice in India and also heads its consumer product sector in the Asia-Pacific region. Educated from IIM Ahmedabad and IIT Delhi, Mr. Abheek Singhi joined the BCG in 1998 and since then has lent his expertise to a cross-country clientele on issues related to strategy, operational excellence and organizational improvement. He has been a member of the National FMCG and Retail Committees of the Confederation of Indian Industry for several years. Mr. Abheek Singhi has co-written the book The $10 Trillion Prize and has also authored several reports on the Indian consumer and retail sector, including The Tiger Roars and Building a New India. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Abheek Singhi on stage with a big round of applause.
Thank you, team. Over to you, sir. Check. Good afternoon, members of IMA, entrepreneurs, Mr. Ambassador, students, ladies and gentlemen. A few days back, I actually got an invitation to come to Indore for the Golden Jubilee Convention. And initially I actually said, I'm really sorry I will not be able to come because I needed to be in Udaipur on the 18th and the 19th, and on the 20th I'm actually going to be running the Mumbai Marathon for a charity, and therefore I will not be able to come. But I actually have long association with Indore. The first time that I was in Indore was in the mid-80s. As my connections are both personal and professional. The first time I was here was in the mid-80s. I'd come here to meet my Masi, who's been living here for 40, 50 years. And I was very struck by the idyllic charm of the city. A few years later, I got married and my connections to Indore only increased because my wife's Nanihal is in Indore, and my trips to Indore kept on increasing. So I was persuaded softly and not so softly by many people to say you have to make sure that you come here. So I changed my plans, and it's really a pleasure and a privilege to be here in one of the most dynamic cities in India today. So thank you for having me here. What I'm going to be talking about today is some research that my colleagues and I have been doing on India and China, and that took the form of this book that we've written. Now, I realize that I'm in a very strange position that I'm going to be talking to you, and it's actually a fairly unenviable task. Winston Churchill once said that there are three things that are difficult to do. He said the first is, if you try to climb a ladder which is towards you, it's very difficult to climb that ladder. The second thing is, if you're trying to kiss a girl who's moving away from you. And the third thing is, if you are trying to speak after a set of brilliant speakers and before lunch. So I know that I stand between you and So I know that I stand between you and lunch, and therefore I'm going to try to lay out the key messages of what the research indicates into very short and memorable stages. So let me start with asking something to all of you. If you look at what's happening in the world today, so if you look at the headlines, what are the headlines like? And this is a sample of headlines over the course of the last year and a half. So you look at UK and there seems to be a problem with the financial crisis. If you move to the Middle East, North Africa, there's the Arab Spring, which actually does not seem to be leading to spring. The America before the election was caught in a bipartisan situation, and after the election the situation doesn't seem to have improved. Europe seems to be going through its own troubles. The world is concerned about what's going to happen to China, in India the growth is slowing down. There's bad news everywhere. And even in the discussions that we've had today this morning, there have been hints on the fact that the world was actually going through a very good phase, 2005, 2006, 2007, and then the bankers basically decided to wreck the world and we got into the global financial crisis, and we've never been able to get out of that, right? So if I was to ask you here, if you look at the stage of the world economy, Indian economy, how do you think we are doing today? People who feel that we are doing okay, can they raise their hands? People who think we are doing okay. People who think, okay, so we have a set of hands. People who think we are actually doing badly. We see slightly more hands. People who think we are doing better than okay, but not very good. We see some more hands. People who think we are doing very well. So the fact is, a lot of news which is there in the press today, they paint a rather gloomy picture, right? One interesting statistic to share with you, in the week before the Greek elections, our analytics team did a research in terms of saying what share of the global headlines is about the Greek elections. And the figure was a staggering 18%. So 18% of the world headline news from America, Europe to Asia and Africa was about the Greek elections. And that's about an economy which is 0.2% of the world's population. It is 0.4% of the world GDP. So there's a lot of news about something which is fairly insignificant. In the week that the change of power was happening in China, which I'm sure everybody would agree is a slightly larger number of people and a slightly larger economy, the share of the headline news across the world was less than 5%. So why is it that there is a lot of noise about something which is not so significant? When I first shared this, some people said, you know what, it's not about Greece. It is about Spain, it is about Portugal, it is about Italy. So let's put it all together. We are talking about 2% of the world's population. We are talking about 5%, 6% of the global GDP. The fact is that we are living today in the best period of world's history. What has happened is we look at things which are 1 quarter, 2 quarters, 1 year, 2 years. These are the facts. We are living today in the best period in the world history ever. In the decade 2001 to 2011, if you look at 2 parameters on which to see how good the world is, the 2 parameters is what's happening on war, terrorism, violence. The extent of terrorism, violence, conflict was down 50% from the 1990s. It was down 75% from the last 5 decades, which included the Cold War, which included the Vietnam War, Korean War, everything. And it was down 99% from what had happened in World War II. So we are actually living in the most peaceful period in world history. We don't recognize that because there is greater magnification of every incident that happens. But that's a fact. The second is what's happening on the economic front. And if you look at on the economic front, even though the growth has slowed down after the economic crisis, we are still living in the most dynamic period in the world economic history. The only parallel that you can see to this is the period between 1870 to 1885 or 1900 in North America and Europe. That's the only period which comes even comparable to what is the extent of people rising above their economic standards ever before. So this is just to leave a thought that, though we will see about getting future ready, many times when we look at the future, we see the downside much more than the upside. So my first message is, as we think about getting future ready, let's just keep in mind that things are actually getting better. Could they be getting even better? Absolutely. Could we be growing at 8-9% growth? Absolutely. Could we be doing a better job of eradication of poverty? Absolutely. All that is there, but let's not kick ourselves too much. That's the first one. Now, let's start with a few things that I wanted to talk about. The first is the $10 trillion prize. So what is the $10 trillion prize? The $10 trillion prize is the size of the consumer economy in China and India in 2020. And now, why is this important? It is important because this is going to be one of the largest markets which is going to get created. And what's really driving this? If there is one statistic that you remember from this talk, it is this. Imagine you are somebody who's born in China in 1960. Your life expectancy at that point of time was 47 years. Your consumption, per capita consumption in real dollars, this is inflation adjusted, was $100. 47 years later, you would have consumed about $1,000 at the time of your death. Over your entire expected lifespan, you would have consumed about $17,000. Contrast it to this person's grandchild, born nearly 50 years later in 2009. That person, over her lifetime, is expected to consume more than $500,000, and inflation unadjusted. So, including whatever has happened from a lifestyle perspective, from an economic perspective, there is a massive consumption which is going to happen for this generation, 38, 40 times more. If you look at the same thing for India, the same person's grandchild will consume over her lifetime about 20 times more. Now, why is this good? And there is an argument to be made that this is actually can be bad, because if suddenly everybody starts consuming so much, where are the natural resources? I'll just get back to that point in a minute. But the first issue is you are seeing a massive increase in economic growth. You're seeing a massive increase in what people earn, in what people spend, and what that is going to do to the Indian, Chinese, and the global economy is massive. Just to put things in perspective, we are going to, most of the organizations in the world today serve the top billion customers or consumers. If you look at, whether it is the Nokias or the Apples of the world, whether you look at the Unilever and the P&Gs of the world, they effectively are serving the top billion and a half, if you want to be generous, consumers of the world. There is a residual consumption which is happening for the next 4 billion through just the fact that they are around the core which is there. And then you have the real bottom of the pyramid which is not being served. The traditional hypothesis has been to say, we will create a model which is catering to the top billion, strip it down a little bit, and let's figure out how do we serve the emerging consumers in countries like China and India, and see, what is it that can come out. The fact remains that these economies are becoming more and more important at every stage. Today, if you look at it, the largest market for BMW in the world is China. The largest market for LVMH is China. If you look at the markets for some of the categories including cell phones, soaps, detergents, beauty products, etc., India and China constitute in some categories a larger market than the European Union and US put together. So here we have a situation where some markets are becoming massive enough for people to start paying attention to it. So we are going to have a situation which is going to be different. What is really driving that? And to my mind, statistics tell half the story. The real part of what's happening in terms of leadership is coming from the consumers, from the leaders of countries like China and India. Give you an example of a set of people that we met. So the person that you see on the bottom left is a 55-year-old farmer who lives about 2.5 hours from Beijing. The first time that I met her was about 4 years back. Her income from 1999 to 2008 had increased about 10 times. The reason? She had switched from growing wheat and rice to growing corn. That had resulted in a 10 times increase in her income over that time period. Her son had also started working, and therefore now they had plans to build a house. I saw the house in 2009 and I was struck by the fact that in her living room there were 2 holes which were there. And I could not understand, why is there a need for those 2 holes? And I asked her, why are you building these 2 holes? And the interpreter looked at me as if I was asking a stupid question, but he still went and asked her. And she gave him a quizzical look and then said, 2-3 years later, I will have more money and I will actually buy 2 air conditioners to put it here. And she said it very matter-of-factly. Last year, I went back to the same village, to the same house, and lo and behold, there were actually 2 air conditioners there. Today, 65% of Chinese households actually have air conditioners because that is what they want and that is what they are able to get. How is this different from what you see in the West? Every year, BCG does a survey of about 25,000 consumers across the world saying, do you think the world is going to get better, etc. In China and India, in 2012 autumn, 80% of the consumers, 78% in China, 82% in India, felt that the future generation will have a better life than what they did. In the US, the number was 21%. The reason why we need to be prepared for the future differently is in this part of the world, you see a degree of optimism, hope, ambition, aspiration, which is unmatched. We have, for the first time, I think in India, people who have been born, who have grown up in the period after 1991, people who are sitting, on the top, they actually believe that they can. When Nike runs its ad and says, just do it, the people who believe it are not people who are reduced that sitting here, but the people who are sitting up there. I call them the Gen I. The Gen I, the I stands for independence, the I stands for invincibility. Over the course of my work, I get a chance to meet people from all walks of life, all ages of life. I find people who are 30 or below still have this confidence that they will go ahead and change the world. And I actually believe that the reason why we may be future ready is because we as a nation have this group which is still going to be significant not only today but in 10 years time and 15 years time. I truly believe that if you look at the decade from 2010 to 2020, I think China will grow faster than us. But the decade of 2020 to 2030 is a time it could be India's decade. But what is required to make it India's decade is the critical question. So the size of the prize, and I'm not going to go through the numbers, is large. India and China, as you look at it, are separated by 7 years. Now, to many people who have gone to China in the recent past would say that I have smoked something illegal before coming here. If you look at the infrastructure in China, it's 20 years, 25 years ahead. But if you look at the core macroeconomic drivers in terms of consumption-led economy, you actually find that in category after category, you find the difference between India and China as 7 years. The interesting thing is the more premium you go, the gap increases. It is close to 10 years. The more mass you go, the gap reduces. So India today sells the same number of cell phones that China did 5 years back. But BMW sells in India in 2012 the same number of cars that it sold in China in 2002. So the decade gap still remains, but that's something which can be made up in the next decade. Now, if the size of price is so large, is it so easy to win? And the fact of the matter is, it's not. I'm sure that to an audience like this, which has entrepreneurs and students of management and economics, I'm not going to spend too much time getting into the details of each one of these areas. The fact remains that India and China are not countries. They are continents. I've never heard of anybody saying that this is how I'm going to win in Europe. It's about how I'm going to win in France, Germany, Italy, etc. In India, when you think about winning, in China, when you think about winning, you need to recognize the diversity in languages, in cultures, between food, non-food, infrastructure, everything. It's very, very diverse. The second is consumers who actually want it all. We hope that we will introduce the Paisa Vasool terminology in management jargon over the course of the next few years. But this is what it is. I recall that that Mr. Basil, you were referring in your speech to the price-sensitive Indian markets. Our research actually shows that in both markets, China and India, people are price-sensitive, but much more than that, they are value-sensitive. So people in China and India would be willing to pay that extra 100 rupees or 1,000 rupees for a Whirlpool refrigerator or an LG cell phone or a Samsung cell phone if they believe that a product is superior. It's not just because of the brand alone. Number three is the infrastructure challenges. I'm sure that many of the entrepreneurs actually feel it day in and day out. That is a challenge. And it's not only about the physical infrastructure, it is about the systemic infrastructure. How do you make sure that you are able to do your work, you are able to conduct your business without spending X% of your time on managing the environment? And finally, supply side complexities. Volatility is very high and so on and so forth. So, winning in these markets is actually not easy. And that's why there are very few companies that have been successful in both countries. If you look at Unilever, it's extremely successful in India, not so successful in China. If you look at P&G, it's the other way around. LG has done very well in India, so has Hyundai. If you look at China, it's not the case. So, it's not that there are many companies who have cracked the puzzle of winning both markets. And one of the reasons is both of these markets represent large opportunities and large challenges. The biggest constraint that we have found in our research about why companies are not able to win in both markets is because of an absence of leadership. There are simply not enough good people who can actually go ahead and build the businesses in these markets. And people who are actually good enough, entrepreneurs in both these countries, face no challenge in scaling up their business to 100 crores, 500 crores, maybe in the recent past 1,000 crores. But making that next leap becomes a challenge because you find that leadership is not only about that one CEO, it's about having multiple people at multiple levels who are going to act as leaders. The biggest constraint is people, the biggest constraint is talent, the biggest constraint is education. If you think about it, it's a strange paradox because here is one country of 1.2 billion people, another country of 1.3 billion people, and we are talking about a lack of people. But that's what the issue is. We don't have the required educational infrastructure, and in every sense of the word, it's ITIs, it is primary education, it is secondary education, it's technical education. That's the piece which is lacking right now, which will actually create the next wave of growth. And therefore, if there is one thing which is required to be ready for the future, it is investment in education of every type in both countries. I think on that front, China has started making some headway. We still are just taking baby steps. We've been talking about many things, but seeing action on the ground is something that needs to be done. I had a set of slides, but I'm actually going to skip, because of some feedback that I'm getting from the group. So I was sharing with my panelists just before that one of the scariest presentations that I've ever made was something I made in December, and this was a group which included students and entrepreneurs, and they're a very technically sophisticated group. So on the TV screen, so there's a big screen here, there was a screen which was here, and each of the individual participants' audience also had an ability to give instant feedback on the presentation on Facebook and Twitter, and which was played back to the speaker right then and there. So you had this situation, I wasn't sure, should I speak what I was supposed to speak, or should I look at what the feedback was, and after I saw some of the feedback, I decided to ignore the feedback. But in the interest of time, I'm going to skip through the details of some of this and really get to the last part around the few who got it right. And I'm going to leave you with two stories which represent what is required to win in these markets. So on this page you will see a set of words in terms of requirements for success. I'm not actually going to talk about what you see on the slide. You can actually read about that, what's there. What's important is what I refer to at the bottom as the accelerator mindset. In China, there is a company called Singhi. Has anybody heard of this company? Singhi? I can't see any. So, Singhi is a food company. It sells noodles, it sells beverages, it sells green tea. If you look at all food companies, financial performance from 2001 to 2012, Singhi stands out because it is a company which was founded in 1992. Till 2000, it actually had a turnover of less than $200 million. Today, the market capitalization of Singhi is close to $60 billion. Last year, PepsiCo actually sold part of their beverages business in China to Singhi and have taken a stake in that entity. It's the first time in the history that they've done something like that. Now, what is it about this company, which is 20 years young, as the promoter calls it, which allowed it to get into a market cap of $60 billion, and the numbers only keep on increasing over this time period. And there are 2-3 things which he said which was very interesting. Number one, he said, I saw that there were local Chinese companies which were selling noodles at equivalent of 10 cents a packet, and the Nestlés of the world were selling at 60 cents a packet. There was a huge gap in the middle of trying to sell something at 30 cents. The 10 cents quality was average, the 60 cents quality was great, but people really wanted something at 30 cents which had good quality. And that's something which I discovered. And how I discovered it is, I used to be going on the trains in China, carrying my packs with me, and I would give them to people, sell it, and people would consume it by adding hot water, and I would get instant feedback. And based on that instant feedback, I kept on changing. Even today, this person spends 1 day a month traveling in the trains, seeing how the consumers are responding to his products. So being there out in the market. The second thing which was very interesting was, we were talking about what's his 3-year, 5-year, 10-year strategy. And he said, I have a 10-year goal. I have a 10-year goal that I need to be growing at about 20% every year, and I need to maintain my profitability. I don't have a 10-year strategy. And I said, what is it that you mean you don't have a 10-year strategy? He said, the world is changing so fast, it will be stupid for me to create a 10-year strategy. So I am not creating a 10-year strategy. I am creating people who can create and execute 1-year strategy every year for the next 10, 15, 20 years. So he was actually recognizing that there is going to be a lot of change and investing in capabilities rather than structures. The third thing, which was interesting, which actually was very similar to another person that we interviewed, was Adi Godrej. So I was there with one of my co-authors who's a 54-year American, and he said, what is it that you are setting as a target for yourself? So she said, our plan is to be 10 by 10. So he said, what do you mean by 10 by 10? He said, we have to be 10 times our size in 10 years. He said, you recognize that is a 26% growth. He said, yes, but if we don't become a $30 billion group from a $3 billion group, everything else is not good enough. So that is what is required. And it was fascinating to hear what entrepreneurs, what students, what individuals in both the countries are talking about in terms of ambition and aspirations for themselves and their countries, which actually gives me hope that when we are talking about being future ready, the only constraint that we have is the ones which exist in our mind. So I think the one last message to send is, if you are setting a goal for yourself, your organization, the only constraints which are there are the ones in your mind. Everything else can actually be worked around very simply, very easily. As I said, this is the best period in world's history. This generation, this country, we are all lucky to be born, those who are born in the 80s and the 90s. There has never been a better period to be born in this country. Make the most of it. Thank you.